Station. Tonight, we will be taking a look into the Cold War, where a major development is taking place.
Yesterday, the capital of South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam, and the war has ended. During this time, American troops, diplomats, and Vietnamese associated with the Southern government were being evacuated.
The Cold War has been dominating politics for the past 30 years. In Asia, a major conflict called the Korean War raged for 3 years and ended in 1953. The war started when troops from North Korea crossed the border and caught the Southern troops off guard. Northern troops eventually occupied Seoul, South Korea's capital.
After seeing this, President Truman sent help and sent military forces led by General Douglas MacArthur. Then Americans pushed North Korea to the Chinese border, but the Chinese then entered the war on the side of the Communists. After joining the war, the Communists pushed the Americans and South Koreans back to Seoul. After this, a stalemate ensued, and the armistice was signed in 1953.
Also during the Korean War, a Red Scare swept through the country. Senator MacArthur led a campaign against suspected communists. When MacArthur was being investigated, a hearing was filmed. MacArthur came across as a bully and lost popularity and credibility.
Another major event in the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The presidential election of 1960 was taking place, and John F. Kennedy beat Richard Nixon with a slim difference. Kennedy was elected in a difficult time in American history because the Soviet Union and the United States were in a heated conflict battling to protect democracy and communism.
Around this time, a man named Fidel Castro attempted to start a communist revolution and overthrow the Cuban government, and it was successful. The first communist country in the Western Hemisphere.
The Americans did not enjoy seeing a communist regime being set up in their own backyard and started to plan an attack. The Americans trained the Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro and his army. The exiles were sent to Cuba, but were outnumbered and were defeated by the communist military. This humiliating defeat for the United States became known as the Bay of Pigs.
The Soviet Union started to help build Cuban missiles. Soviet ships began to cruise to Cuba, but were forced to turn around at the last second due to trying to avoid nuclear war with the United States. The two superpowers made a compromise that the Soviets would remove their missiles if the U.S. did not invade Cuba. This event was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis.
More Latin American countries were turning to communism. John F. Kennedy made a program called Alliance for Progress to persuade democracy for poor countries. If the country turned democracy, the U.S. would give them aid in return. For example, volunteers built schools, hospitals, and whatever else was needed for the country. The USA also later sent military aid to Latin American forces.
Kennedy also set up the Peace Corps. American volunteers worked as teachers, engineers, and advisors in developing countries. Another program Kennedy set up was the Organization of American States. This promoted the economic progress in the Americas by investing in industry and transportation.
The United States and Soviet Union both had many missiles, but didn't want to start a nuclear war. The Soviets soon sent up Sputnik, the first satellite in outer space. As a result of Sputnik, Kennedy set up NASA to show the American competition and strength.
In 1963, Lev Harry Oswald shot President John F. Kennedy in Dallas. Oswald was soon assassinated by Jack Ruby in retaliation of the president's death. As a result of Kennedy's death, Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn into office.
Lyndon Johnson created a program called the Great Society. It was made to create a decent living for Americans. It also pushed many laws through Congress, which included Medicare, Medicaid, Office of Economic Opportunity, and job training programs. This program gave loans to farmers and needy businessmen. Many houses were built for middle-income families, too.
Congress also developed the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Robert Weaver was the head of the department. All of these programs in the Great Society were very controversial.
The French were finally pushed out of Vietnam in 1954. They were defeated by the communist named Ho Chi Minh. After a treaty between the Vietnamese and the French, the country was split into the North and the South.
A communist regime was set up in the North and was led by the leader of the revolution himself, Ho Chi Minh. An anti-communist regime was set up in the South by a man named Ngo Dinh Diem. The Soviets supplied northern Vietnam and the United States supported southern Vietnam.
Diem lost much popularity due to his corruption, so many joined the Viet Cong, who opposed Diem. The Viet Cong fought in a hit-and-run attacks, or guerrilla warfare. Over time, the Viet Cong became communist and supported North Vietnam. This influence quickly spread through the villages all over Vietnam, north and south.
The Americans were afraid that the domino theory would take effect if South Vietnam fell to the north. If the South fell, they believed others would follow, so the USA decided they would fight to keep democracy in Vietnam. They sent advisors to train the troops. Diem was assassinated.
Johnson continued to send military aid, but the Viet Cong continued to advance. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was made to make all measures to repel armed attacks and future aggression. Johnson decided to bomb northern Vietnam. This meant that military advisors would become active fighters. Now there were more than 500,000 troops in Vietnam.
Instead of gaining ground, the new goal was to destroy the enemy positions. But because the Viet Cong were so quick and agile, it was hard to follow and find and destroy them. In the Vietnamese villages, American soldiers could not tell who the enemy was because it would be literally anyone.
The Tet Offensive took place in January 1968. The Viet Cong made a surprise attack on the southern cities. They even stormed the American embassy, but in the end, the South pushed back the Viet Cong. Even though it was an American victory, this showed that there was nowhere safe to go in Vietnam. Americans started to protest the war, so Johnson decided not to run for president again.
Civil rights and protesting in the Vietnam War grew. The people also began to watch the horrors of the war on television. A military draft was set up for the Vietnam War, but Americans found ways around it, including going to college. So most that were sent away were poor, African, or Latino. Many riots started to show an anti-war opinion.
New groups were made because of the war too. Hawks supported the American involvement in the war, but the Doves didn't. These Doves thought that South Vietnam was corrupt, so many others joined the counterculture movement. This went against American values. The protesters called for peace, justice, and social equality.
The Democrats chose Robert Kennedy as their candidate, but he was soon assassinated like his brother. They now chose Hubert Humphrey as their candidate. The Republicans chose Richard Nixon as their nominee. Nixon barely won the election, so there was a new change in leadership in the White House.